Alright, so the first thing you want to do is remove this cotter pin from the hub nut. Now remove the center cover on the rim to get access to the hub nut while the car is lowered down on the wheel. And I use this 34mm socket to remove that hub nut. I had to make use of a breaker bar. It was very difficult to remove this hub nut. So I ended up using some penetrating oil, liquid wrench in this case. You can use WD-40 or whatever else you prefer. Even after spraying this though, it's extremely difficult to remove that hub nut. So I ended up having to attach a pipe to the end of the breaker bar to get enough leverage to break the nut. Now, unfortunately, I don't have footage of when I attached the pipe, but this is the same technique that I used. Later on in the video, you're going to see me use this technique to remove the bolt from the strut assembly. So at this point, the technique I use is loosen the bolt. So now we're just trying to hold in place the rotor so that we can take the hub nut off of the vehicle. So at this point, we're just removing the brake hose from the strut assembly, as well as the ABS sensor wire. It's very delicate, so be very careful with that. Okay, here we need to remove the strut from the steering knuckle. There are two bolts here. Once again, make use of some type of penetrating oil. Also, at some point here, I struggled removing one of these bolts as well. So I use the same technique of connecting a pipe basically to this breaker bar. Here you're going to use a punch tool to get this screw out of the socket here. Be careful not to ruin the threads. Here I'm using the crowbar to move the steering knuckle off of the strut assembly. Now this is a good opportunity where we can get the outer portion of the axle from behind the rotor. Okay, the next step is to remove the inner portion of the axle from the transmission. Notice here that I've placed an oil catch pan underneath the transmission because I have not drained the transmission of fluid, because just recently I had actually flushed and filled the transmission gear oil. Now every time I've done this job, I've always found it easier to remove the axle than to replace it. Here you can see me using the crowbar once again just to dislodge the axle. always making sure that that oil pan is right underneath that transmission to catch the fluid that's going to drain out. Now I have seen some videos out there of people removing the lowest control arm, but this is the method I've used. It's also the method I've seen in the Haynes manual that I own. By the way, definitely if you're going to tackle this job, get a Haynes manual or some other real good service manual. And with this particular job, this is something where you might want to have a friend who's done some work on a car before. That this one's a little more advanced, I'd say, than doing maybe the oil change or even brakes. Uh, what you're going to really find tricky, I find, with this job is replacing the axle. One thing that I did do to help get better clearance to the transmission is there's this access panel here. I did move it aside. It made getting the axle back in place a little easier. And here we're going to go ahead and put some high temperature grease on the axle splines before we place them back into the hub. So at this point, the inner portion of the axle is in place. I do not have footage of me doing that because at one point I got extremely frustrated. I've done this job 3 times on this vehicle, and each time this is, like I said, the most frustrating part because you turn the axle, you try to knock it in, you turn it, you try to knock it in, and you always feel like you're almost putting too much force. It's almost like a brute force method at some point. I had to walk away a couple of times. Eventually, you keep turning and you push it, and there's a little C-clip there, and it has to kind of be in the right place to lock the transmission into, or at least the axle into the transmission. And at this point, we're pretty much doing the reverse of the removal of the axle. Here I'm putting the hub nut back in place. Now we're attaching the steering knuckle back to the strut. Now we're going to make use of a torque wrench to make sure that that hub nut is back in place and on properly. Once again, the use of tools is so important. You've seen me do this before. We have to make sure we have the right torque wrenches to get the steering knuckle back in place, as well as that hub nut. Now once that's squared away, we just want to make sure that the brake line is reattached to the strut, as well as the sensor wire. And then also put all of the shields back in place as well, if you remove them for access. In here I've put the wheel back on to hold the hub in place so that we could put the axle nut back on and torque it properly. Now our last course of action here is to refill the fluid that we lost from our manual transmission. So here I had to remove the fill plug. Now, one thing you have to do to get access to this fill plug, I actually used a hose here, a combination of hoses that you can see I snake through underneath the vehicle. I plug it into the fill hole and snake it up to the top near the motor. And once you get to the top of the vehicle, I'd say I have a funnel that I connect to this hose. And basically, the method is that you have to fill the transmission until oil starts to leak out of it. Basically, it'll sort of self-level as long as the car is leveled and flat on the ground. I had actually lost about a quart. uh, you can check it by maybe putting some type of, I use like a maybe something like a paper clip that'll show you whether or not your gear oil is at the level. So as I mentioned earlier, the car has to be level. So I'm bringing the car down above the drain pan, and then we could start to replace the gear oil that we lost. And so we're going to use the MT90 gear oil that we lost about a quart there. So as you can see here, all we're going to do is just fill that all back up, about 1 quart, maybe a little over a quart that I had. So you'll know you're done with filling up the manual transmission when you start to see the oil dripping out of the drip plug. You can check by using a piece of metal. As you can see here, it's not completely full yet, so we have to go ahead and continue to fill up the transmission. And now you can see we're pretty much here done because the fill hole is draining out. So you have to make sure the vehicle is leveled and allow it to drain out until it stops, and then you'll know that you're right at the level you need to be. And here I'm using that technique again with a little piece of metal, and we can see that the transmission is full. And then we're going to go ahead and put the fill hole plug back in place. And then we're going to go ahead and jack the car back up and make sure it's extremely secure. Cannot stress the importance of making sure the car is sitting on the stands properly with chucks on the front and back of those wheels to make sure that the car doesn't move. Once again, safety first. Once the car is nice and secure, we're going to go ahead and pull out our torque wrench and make sure that this bolt is torqued to specifications. So that completes our overview of the replacement of the driver's side axle on the 2002 to 2003 Nissan Maxima with a manual transmission. I hope this video was useful. Be safe and drive safely.